The Arizona wind carried more than dust that November evening in 1876. It carried the scent of change. Elena Martinez pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood on the porch of her adobe ranch house, watching the sun bleed red across the desert horizon. At 27, she had already buried one husband and fought off 3 different men trying to claim her land. The Martinez ranch sat on prime water rights, and in this parched country, water meant everything. Mrs. Martinez. Tom Bradley, her foreman, emerged from the barn with his hat in his weathered hands, found more fence cut near the south pasture, lost maybe 30 head. Eleanor's jaw tightened. James Thornton, the banker from Tucson, had been pressuring her to sell for months. When words failed, he'd turned to more direct methods. Same spot as last week? Yes, ma'am. But there's something else. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Apache sign near the creek. Fresh tracks, maybe 2 days old. The word Apache sent a familiar chill through the small community. Since the government had been trying to force the tribes onto reservations, tensions had reached a breaking point. Raids on both sides had left the frontier soaked in blood, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. Elena nodded grimly. Double the night watch, and Tom, make sure the boys know to shoot first if they see anyone they don't recognize. As Tom disappeared into the gathering dusk, Elena remained on the porch, her dark eyes scanning the horizon. She thought of her husband Miguel, killed 2 years ago in an Apache raid near the Mexican border. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now faced the same threat that had made her a widow. Miles away, across the desert floor dotted with saguaro cacti and mesquite, Aiyana crouched beside a small fire hidden in a rocky outcropping. At 27, he was considered a skilled warrior among his people, but lately, he felt as lost as a man wandering in a sandstorm. The old ways were dying, and his tribe was being pushed toward a reservation that felt more like a grave. His grandfather, Nalnish, had taught him to read the stars, to find meaning in their patterns. "The sky holds all the answers," the old man had said before the soldiers took him away. "When you are lost, look up. The stars will guide you to your true path." For months, Aiyana had been following a particular constellation that seemed to pull him westward, away from the escalating violence between his people and the white settlers. His tribal brothers thought him foolish for pursuing dreams while their world crumbled around them, but something deeper than reason drove him forward. Tonight, the stars seemed brighter, more insistent. He stood, his muscled frame silhouetted against the starlit sky, and studied the heavens. The constellation he'd been following pointed directly toward the valley below, where the lights of a ranch house flickered like earthbound stars. A vision came to him, not supernatural, but the kind of clarity that sometimes visited warriors before important battles. He saw a woman with dark hair and sad eyes, standing alone against forces that threatened to destroy her. The image felt as real as the ground beneath his feet. "I hear you," he whispered to the night sky, "but I don't understand." The next morning brought trouble to Elena's doorstep in the form of Sheriff Clayton Wells and 3 of Thornton's men. Wells, a large man with a permanent scowl, had never been subtle about whose interests he served. "Morning, Mrs. Martinez," Wells said, not bothering to dismount. "Had reports of Apache activity in this area. Might be safer if you reconsidered Mr. Thornton's offer." Elena stepped onto the porch, her hand resting casually on the Winchester rifle leaning against the doorframe. "Sheriff, I've been defending this land since before you pinned on that badge. I'm not about to run now because of some tracks. Tracks that led to 30 missing cattle," one of Thornton's men interjected. "Seems to me like you're harboring hostiles." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Elena's eyes flashed with anger. "Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Peterson?" Before Peterson could respond, Tom Bradley emerged from the barn with 2 ranch hands, their hands conspicuously near their weapons. The message was clear. Elena Martinez wasn't standing alone. Sheriff Wells raised a placating hand. "Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Just saying it might be wise to accept some protection. Mr. Thornton's made a generous offer, and I've given him my answer." Elena's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "This ranch isn't for sale, Sheriff. Not to Thornton, not to anyone." As the men rode away, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the noose was tightening around her neck. She was strong, but she was also realistic. How long could one woman hold out against the combined pressure of hostile tribes, greedy land grabbers, and a corrupt sheriff? That evening, as she checked on her horses in the stable, a sound made her freeze. It wasn't the wind or the settling of the building. It was the soft footfall of someone trying very hard not to be heard. Elena's hand moved to the Colt revolver at her hip, her heart pounding as she peered into the shadows. "I mean, no harm," came a deep voice from the darkness. The English was accented but clear. "I seek only shelter for the night." Elena drew her weapon, her hands steady despite her racing pulse. "Step into the light, where I can see you." A figure emerged from the shadows, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. The man was tall and lean, with long black hair and features that clearly marked him as Apache. But it wasn't his appearance that made her hesitate. It was his eyes. They held a depth of sadness and wisdom that seemed older than his years, and something else she couldn't quite name. "You're on private land," she said, her gun still trained on him. "I know." He made no move toward his weapons. "The stars led me here. I had prayed for a sign." His gaze met hers directly, without challenge but without submission. "Perhaps you are the answer I have been seeking." Elena kept her revolver steady, but something in Aiyana's manner made her finger ease off the trigger. In 2 years of widow's vigilance, she'd learned to read men's intentions in their eyes. This Apache warrior, despite being capable of killing her before she could blink, showed no hostility, only a strange, almost reverent curiosity. "Stars don't lead people to steal cattle," she said, her voice cautious but no longer threatening. "I do not steal." Aiyana's response was quiet but firm. "I track those who do. 3 of my people took your animals, but they act without the blessing of our elders. I have come to make this right." Elena's mind raced. An Apache offering to help recover stolen cattle? It defied everything she'd been taught about his people, yet something in his bearing suggested he spoke the truth. "And why would you do that?" "Because the vision that brought me here showed a woman standing alone against darkness. I believe that woman is you." He gestured toward the night sky visible through the stable door. "My grandfather taught me that the stars do not lie, even when the world has forgotten how to tell truth." Before Elena could respond, Tom Bradley's voice cut through the night air. "Mrs. Martinez?" Heard voices. "You all right?" Elena saw Aiyana tense, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. She made a split-second decision that would change everything. "I'm fine, Tom. Just checking on Thunder. Thought I heard something spook him." "You sure I can come take a look?" "No need, get some rest. We've got an early morning ahead." Tom's footsteps faded away, and Elena slowly lowered her weapon. Aiyana's expression showed surprise, and something that might have been gratitude. "Why did you protect me?" he asked. Elena holstered her Colt, studying his face in the lamplight. "Maybe because I'm tired of solving everything with bullets. Maybe because I've learned that enemies and allies don't always look like what we expect." She paused, then added quietly, "Or maybe because I've been praying for help, and I can't afford to turn it away, no matter what form it takes." The next morning brought the worst blizzard Arizona had seen in a decade. Snow fell thick and fast, turning the desert landscape into an alien world of white drifts and howling winds. Elena found Aiyana still in the stable, having spent the night in an empty stall rather than risk discovery by her ranch hands. "Your cattle are in a box canyon 8 miles north," he said without preamble, "but in this storm, we cannot reach them safely. The men who took them are trapped there as well." Elena pulled her coat tighter. "My foreman and the hands are snowed in at the bunkhouse. Even if the weather clears, it'll be days before we can mount a search." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Unless someone knows the land well enough to travel in conditions like this. I know these mountains as my ancestors did, but such a journey—" He met her eyes. "It would be dangerous for both of us. Your people would call you traitor for riding with an Apache. Mine would call me the same for helping a white woman. Then we'd better make sure we both make it back alive," Elena said with a grim smile. They set out within the hour, leading 2 horses through the blinding snow. Aiyana had insisted on an old mining trail that wound through the hills, longer but more sheltered than the direct route. Elena wore her late husband's heavy coat and carried her Winchester, while Aiyana moved like a shadow beside her, reading the landscape through the storm with an almost supernatural skill. "Tell me about this vision," Elena said during a brief rest in a grove of snow-laden pines. The intimacy of their shared danger had broken down the initial barriers between them. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "For months I have seen a woman in my dreams. Dark hair, strong hands, eyes that have known loss but have not surrendered to it. She stood against forces that would destroy what she loves, but she stood alone." He looked at her directly. "When I saw you last night, I knew the vision was true." Elena felt something stir in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the small fire they'd built. "I've been alone for 2 years. Sometimes I think I've forgotten how to trust anyone." "Trust is not forgotten," Aiyana said softly. "It is only buried beneath fear and pain, like seeds under snow, waiting for the right season to grow again." Their eyes met across the firelight, and Elena felt the ground shift beneath her, not from the storm, but from the recognition of something profound passing between them. This man, who should have been her enemy, understood her loneliness in a way that went deeper than words. "We should keep moving," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier edge. The abandoned mining cabin appeared through the snow like a miracle. Built into the side of a hill and sheltered by overhanging rocks, it offered protection from the worst of the storm. Elena and Aiyana led their horses inside through the wide entrance, originally built for ore wagons. "We'll have to wait here until the storm passes," Elena said, surveying the single room with its stone fireplace and scattered mining equipment. "Could be hours, could be days." Aiyana began gathering wood from a pile left by previous travelers. Soon he had a fire crackling in the hearth, its light dancing off the rough stone walls. Elena found herself watching his movements, economical, graceful, completely without wasted motion. "You move like a dancer," she observed. "My people believe that all of life is a dance," he replied, arranging their supplies near the fire. "Birth, death, love, war, all have their rhythms, their steps that must be learned." "And what dance is this?" Elena asked, gesturing at the space between them. Aiyana looked at her with those dark, knowing eyes. "I think it is the dance of two people who have been walking separate paths, discovering that those paths were always meant to converge." The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin something warmer than the fire was growing. Elena found herself telling Aiyana about Miguel, about the loneliness of running the ranch, about her fears that she was fighting a losing battle against men who would never accept a woman's right to independence. In return, Aiyana spoke of his grandfather's teachings, of watching his people's world shrink as the white settlements expanded, of the impossible choice between resistance that meant death and surrender, that meant the death of everything his ancestors had built. "Sometimes I feel like I'm caught between two worlds," he said, staring into the flames. "No longer fully Apache, not welcome in the white world, belonging nowhere." "You belong here," Elena said quietly, "with me, in this moment." The words surprised them both. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away when Aiyana's gaze found hers. "The stars brought me to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I did not expect them to bring me home." Dawn broke clear and brilliant over the snow-covered mountains. Elena woke to find Aiyana already up, standing silhouetted in the cabin doorway against the pristine white landscape. She'd slept better than she had in months, despite, or perhaps because of, sharing the small space with a man she'd known for less than 2 days. "The storm has passed," he said without turning around, "but the real storm may be just beginning." Elena rose and joined him at the entrance, following his gaze down the valley. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose from what looked like a campfire. "Your people?" 3 young warriors, Naiche, Chato, and Geronimo's nephew, Daklugi. "They seek revenge for the death of Naiche's brother, killed by soldiers last month." Aiyana's voice carried the weight of difficult knowledge. "They will not listen to reason in their current state. And my cattle are with them, yes. But Elena," he turned to face her, and she noticed he'd used her given name for the first time. "If we approach them together, they may see you as a hostage to be killed, or me as a traitor to be executed. There is no safe way to resolve this." Elena checked her rifle and revolver, her movements crisp and decisive. "Then we'd better be very clever about how we handle it." They approached the box canyon carefully, using the fresh snow to muffle their horses' hoofbeats. Elena's 30 head of cattle were penned in a natural corral formed by fallen boulders, while 3 Apache warriors sat around a fire, their horses grazing nearby. Even from a distance, Elena could see the tension in their postures. These were men ready for violence at the slightest provocation. "I will go first," Aiyana said. "Alone. If they accept my words, I will signal you. And if they don't," his dark eyes met hers steadily, "then you ride back to your ranch and forget you ever met me." Before Elena could protest, Aiyana was moving down the slope with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. She watched through her rifle scope as he approached the 3 warriors, his hands visible and empty of weapons. The conversation that followed was too distant to hear, but the body language told the story: initial surprise, then anger, then heated argument. Elena saw Naiche leap to his feet, his hand moving to his knife. Chato grabbed his arm, but Daklugi was already reaching for his rifle. The situation was deteriorating fast. That's when she heard the hoofbeats behind her. Well, well, what do we have here? James Thornton's voice carried across the snow like a death sentence. Elena spun around to find the banker flanked by Sheriff Wells and 6 armed men, all mounted and with weapons drawn. Thornton. Elena kept her voice level despite her racing heart. This is still my land. Not for much longer. Thornton's smile was cold as the mountain air. Sheriff Wells here has a warrant for your arrest, harboring hostile Indians. Seems someone saw you leave town with a known Apache warrior. Wells held up a folded paper. Elena Martinez, you're under arrest for treason against the United States government and conspiracy with enemy combatants. Elena's mind raced. From her position, she could see Aiyana still trying to negotiate with the 3 warriors, unaware of the trap closing around them. Below in the canyon, above on the ridge, they were caught between 2 groups of armed men with every reason to start shooting. You arranged this, she said to Thornton. You had someone watching my ranch. Peterson makes an excellent scout, Thornton admitted. Been tracking you since yesterday. Imagine my surprise when my private detective work turned into a patriotic duty. His expression hardened. You've been cavorting with savages, Elena. Time to pay the price. The first shot rang out from the canyon below. Elena saw Aiyana go down, clutching his shoulder, while Aiyana dove for cover behind a boulder. Chato and Daklugi returned fire, their bullets sparking off rocks. Looks like your Apache friends started the party without us, Wells said, raising his rifle. Boys, let's finish what they started. Elena made her choice in the space of a heartbeat. Instead of surrendering, she spurred her horse forward and down the slope, shouting a warning to Aiyana as bullets whined past her head. Behind her, Thornton's men gave chase, their horses plunging through the snow in a thunder of hooves and gunfire. Aiyana looked up in shock as Elena galloped into the canyon, Thornton's posse close behind. Understanding flashed across his face. They'd been set up, trapped between 2 groups of enemies. He grabbed his rifle and began laying down covering fire, buying Elena precious seconds to reach the shelter of the rocks. This was your plan all along? Elena shouted over the gunfire as she dismounted beside him. Use me to find the cattle thieves and eliminate both problems at once. I swear to you I had nothing to do with this, Aiyana replied, reloading quickly. But we can settle our trust issues after we survive the next 10 minutes. The battle was chaotic and desperate. Aiyana, wounded but still fighting, had taken position with Chato and Daklugi behind a fallen tree. They poured rifle fire up at Thornton's men, while Aiyana and Elena held the opposite end of the canyon, caught in a deadly crossfire. Elena Martinez! Sheriff Wells's voice echoed off the canyon walls. Surrender now, and we'll make sure you get a fair trial. Elena's response was a rifle shot that knocked the hat clean off Peterson's head. That's my answer, Sheriff. Aiyana glanced at her with something that might have been admiration. For a woman who claims to be tired of solving things with bullets, you handle that rifle well. My husband taught me to shoot before he taught me to dance, Elena replied, working the lever action smoothly. Said a woman on the frontier needed to be able to protect what she loved. And what do you love, Elena Martinez? She looked at him, really looked at him. This Apache warrior who'd appeared in her life like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Even with bullets flying around them, even facing almost certain death, she felt more alive than she had in years. I'm still figuring that out, she said quietly. The tide of battle turned when Daklugi managed to work his way up the canyon wall and began firing down at Thornton's men from above. Caught between the high ground and the entrenched defenders, the posse began to retreat, but not before Peterson got off one last desperate shot. Elena saw Aiyana stumble, blood spreading across his shirt. Without thinking, she left her cover and dragged him back behind the rocks, her own body shielding him from further harm. You're hit, she said, her hands already working to assess the wound. I will live, he said through gritted teeth. The bullet went through cleanly. As the sound of retreating hooves faded, Aiyana, Chato and Daklugi approached cautiously. Elena kept her rifle ready, unsure of their intentions now that the common threat had been eliminated. Aiyana spoke to Aiyana in Apache, his voice weak from blood loss but carrying clear authority. Aiyana responded, and Elena caught her own name in the rapid exchange. What did he say? She asked. Aiyana managed a pained smile. He said any woman brave enough to charge into battle to save an Apache warrior has earned the respect of his people. The cattle will be returned to your ranch. And you? I have been invited to recover from my wounds at your ranch, under your protection, if you will have me. Elena looked at this wounded warrior who'd turned her world upside down in the span of 2 days. Sheriff Wells and Thornton would return with more men. Her ranch was still under threat, and she was now officially an outlaw in the eyes of the territorial government. But when she looked into Aiyana's eyes, she saw something worth fighting for, a chance at love that transcended the boundaries that divided their worlds. "I think I can manage one more house guest," she said, helping him to his feet. "But we'd better get you home before you bleed all over my good saddle." 3 weeks had passed since the canyon shootout, and Elena's ranch had become an island of uneasy peace in a territory increasingly torn by violence. Aiyana's wound was healing well under her care, but the situation beyond the ranch boundaries grew more dangerous by the day. Federal troops had been called in to deal with what newspapers were calling the Apache uprising, and bounties had been placed on several warriors' heads, including Aiyana's. Elena stood at her kitchen window, watching Aiyana work with her horses in the corral. His natural skill with animals had impressed even Tom Bradley, though the foreman still maintained a cautious distance. The other ranch hands had gradually accepted the Apache warrior's presence, won over by his willingness to work and his obvious dedication to protecting their employer. "He's got away with that stallion," Tom said, joining Elena at the window. "Thunder hasn't let anyone but you near him since Mr. Miguel died." Elena nodded, her heart clenching as she watched Aiyana gentle the black horse with patient, steady movements. In the past weeks, she'd learned that his hands could be tender as well as deadly, tending wounds, preparing meals, crafting repairs around the ranch with skills passed down through generations. "Tom," she said quietly, "if things get worse, I want you to take the men and leave. Find work somewhere safe." Tom's weathered face creased with concern. "Mrs. Martinez, we've been through this. We're not abandoning you. You might not have a choice." Elena handed him a telegram that had arrived that morning. "Sheriff Wells is bringing a federal marshal and 2 companies of cavalry. They'll be here by week's end." Tom read the message, his expression growing grim. "What are you going to do?" Before Elena could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. But these weren't soldiers or lawmen. They were Apache. Naiche, still bearing his arm in a sling, rode at the head of a small group that included an elderly man Elena didn't recognize. Aiyana emerged from the corral, his face serious as he watched the approaching riders. Elena joined him in the yard, her hand instinctively resting on her revolver. "Nalnish," Aiyana breathed, and Elena realized this must be his grandfather, the one she'd thought had been taken by soldiers months ago. The old Apache dismounted with surprising agility for his age, his piercing eyes taking in the scene, the ranch house, Elena, and his grandson standing protectively beside her. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations. "I have come to see the woman who fought beside my grandson," he said, in accented but clear English. "The woman who has given him shelter when his own people questioned his path." Elena stepped forward, meeting the old man's gaze directly. "You're welcome here, Nalnish. Aiyana has spoken of you often." A slight smile touched the elder's lips. "And he has spoken of you in his letters to me, but words on paper cannot capture what I see before me now." "Grandfather," Aiyana said, switching to Apache. The conversation that followed was too rapid for Elena to follow, but she caught the emotional undercurrents, concern, affection, and what sounded like gentle reproach. Finally, Nalnish turned back to Elena. "My grandson tells me you have found in each other something worth dying for, but I have come to ask if it is something worth living for." Elena felt the weight of the question. In the past weeks, she and Aiyana had grown closer than she'd thought possible, their connection deepening from gratitude and attraction to something that felt like love. But they'd both been so focused on surviving each crisis that they'd never talked about the future. "I don't understand," she said. "The soldiers are coming," Nace interjected. "Not just for Aiyana, but for any Apache who refuses to go to the reservation. Our time of freedom is ending." Nalnish nodded gravely. "There is a place, far to the south in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico. Some of our people have found sanctuary there beyond the reach of American law. We could take you both, start a new life where love is not a crime." Elena's breath caught. She looked at Aiyana, seeing in his eyes both hope and the pain of having to ask her to give up everything she'd built. "Elena," he said softly, "I would not ask this of you lightly, but we both know what's coming. Thornton will not stop until he has your land, and the government will not stop until every Apache is dead or confined. Together we might find peace. Apart, we'll both be destroyed," Elena finished. The truth of it settled over her like a heavy blanket. She thought of Miguel, of the dreams they'd shared for this ranch, of the life she'd fought so hard to preserve. But then she looked at Aiyana, and she realized that some dreams were meant to change, to grow into something larger than what they'd originally been. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked. "The soldiers will arrive in 4 days," Nalnish replied. "We must leave before then, or not at all." That evening, after the Apache had made camp in the hills above the ranch, Elena and Aiyana walked together to Miguel's grave. The simple wooden cross stood among the cottonwoods by the creek, marking the spot where she'd buried her first husband, and, she thought, her capacity for love. "I need to tell him goodbye," she said, kneeling beside the grave. Aiyana stood respectfully back, giving her space for her private conversation with the past. "Miguel," she whispered, her hand touching the earth above his resting place, "I never thought I'd love again after losing you. But this man, he's shown me that love doesn't replace what we've lost. It builds on it, grows from it." The wind rustled through the cottonwoods, and Elena felt a sense of peace settle over her. Miguel had always told her to follow her heart, even when it led her into dangerous territory. This felt like his blessing. When she rejoined Aiyana, he took her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "If we do this," he said, "there will be no going back. We'll be leaving everything familiar behind." "I've been thinking about that," Elena replied. "This ranch, this life, I've been fighting so hard to keep it that I forgot to ask myself if it's what I still want. Maybe it's time to stop fighting the past and start building the future." Aiyana pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "In my culture, when two people join their lives, they become part of each other's stories. Your joys become mine. Your sorrows become mine. Are you prepared for that?" Elena thought of the lonely years since Miguel's death, of the constant struggle to prove herself in a world that seemed determined to defeat her. Then she thought of the past weeks, of how natural it felt to share her burdens with this man, how his presence had brought light back into her world. "I've been alone so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than myself," she said. "Yes, Aiyana, I'm ready to become part of your story." They were married the next morning, in a ceremony that blended traditions from both their cultures. Nalnish performed the Apache ritual, while Elena spoke the vows she'd written in Spanish, the language of her childhood. Tom Bradley stood as witness, tears streaming down his weathered face as he realized this was also a goodbye. "Take care of her," he said to Aiyana afterward, gripping the warrior's hand. "She's the strongest woman I've ever known, but even the strongest steel can break if it's bent too far." "I will guard her life with my own," Aiyana replied solemnly. As the sun reached its zenith, Elena took one last walk through the house she'd shared with Miguel, gathering only the essentials: her mother's rosary, Miguel's wedding ring, a few photographs, and the deed to the ranch, which she'd signed over to Tom with instructions to sell it and divide the proceeds among the workers. "Are you ready?" Aiyana asked, finding her in the bedroom where she was packing her few remaining possessions. Elena looked around the room one more time, at the bed where she'd mourned her first husband, and the window where she'd watched for threats that never seemed to end. Then she looked at Aiyana, at the future standing before her, in the form of a man who'd appeared in her life like a gift from the stars themselves. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. But as they prepared to leave with Nalnish's group, the sound of distant thunder reached their ears. Thunder that came from a clear sky, the thunder of many horses approaching fast. The soldiers had arrived a day early. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger by the minute. Elena counted at least 40 riders, cavalry, federal marshals, and what looked like Thornton's hired guns bringing up the rear. They had maybe an hour before the ranch would be surrounded. "The canyon trail," Nalnish said tersely, pointing toward the mountains. "It's our only chance to reach the border before they can organize pursuit." Elena grabbed her saddlebags and rifle, while Aiyana helped his grandfather prepare their horses. Tom Bradley and the ranch hands had already scattered, following Elena's earlier instructions to disappear into the desert until the danger passed. "Wait," Elena said suddenly, stopping at the edge of the yard. She looked back at the house where she'd built her life with Miguel, where she'd learned to survive alone, where she'd discovered she could love again. "I need one more minute." She ran back inside and emerged carrying a small wooden box. Inside were Miguel's letters to her during their courtship, along with the dried wildflowers from their wedding bouquet. Some memories were too precious to leave behind. "What is it?" Aiyana asked as she secured the box in her saddlebags. "The past," she said simply. "I'm not running from it anymore. I'm taking it with me into whatever comes next." They rode hard toward the mountains, following ancient Apache trails that wound through arroyos and over ridges barely wide enough for a single horse. Elena had never seen this part of the territory, and she marveled at how Nalnish and his people navigated the seemingly impassable terrain with the confidence of eagles riding the wind. Behind them, the dust cloud had reached the ranch. Elena resisted the urge to look back when she heard the distant crack of gunfire. The soldiers were probably shooting at shadows, frustrated by finding their quarry gone. "They'll follow," Nietzsche said, his wounded arm making him lean heavily on his saddle horn. "The trackers with them know these trails." "Let them come," Nalnish replied with grim satisfaction. "The desert has swallowed better men than these." As if summoned by his words, the sky began to darken with the promise of another storm. This time it wasn't snow, but the kind of flash flood that could turn dry washes into raging torrents within minutes. They took shelter in a shallow cave as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Elena watched the storm build, knowing it would erase their tracks, but also trap them until it passed. Time they might not have. "I should never have involved you in this," Aiyana said quietly, sitting beside her at the cave mouth. "You could have sold the ranch to Thornton, started over somewhere safe." Elena took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "And spent the rest of my life wondering what might have been? No, I'd rather face the unknown with you than face a safe, empty future alone." The rain fell in sheets now, turning the desert floor into a temporary lake. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, brilliant flashes, and in one of those moments, Elena saw riders silhouetted on a distant ridge, their pursuers, also seeking shelter from the storm. "They're closer than I thought," she murmured. Nalnish joined them at the cave entrance, his weathered face grave. "The storm will pass within the hour, but we cannot outrun them to the border. They have fresh horses and know we are heading south." "Then we don't go south," Aiyana said suddenly. "At least not all of us." Elena felt her heart skip. "What are you thinking?" "You and grandfather continue toward Mexico with the others. I'll lead the soldiers away, give you time to escape." "Absolutely not," Elena said firmly. "We go together, or not at all." "Elena, be practical. They want me alive to make an example. You they'll simply shoot. If I surrender, they'll hang you," Elena interrupted. "James Thornton doesn't want prisoners. He wants problems solved permanently." Nietzsche spoke up from deeper in the cave. "There is another way. The old silver mine, 2 miles west. It has tunnels that emerge on the other side of the mountain. If we can reach it without being seen." "The mine's been abandoned for years," Elena said. "The tunnels could be flooded or collapsed." "But it's a chance," Aiyana said. "Better than certain capture." As the storm began to subside, they made their decision. The group would split. Nalnish and Nietzsche would continue south with 2 other warriors, leaving an obvious trail for the soldiers to follow. Elena, Aiyana, and Chato would attempt the dangerous passage through the silver mine. "If we don't make it," Elena said to Nalnish as they prepared to part ways, "thank you for accepting me as family." The old Apache placed a gnarled hand on her shoulder. "You are no longer a white woman married to an Apache, or an Apache married to a white woman. You are simply 2 people who have found each other across the divide that separates worlds. That is a sacred thing." The mine entrance was partially hidden by rockfall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering light of torches Chato had fashioned from dried mesquite. The tunnels were a maze of intersecting passages, some flooded ankle-deep with stagnant water, others choked with debris from decades of neglect. Elena tried not to think about cave-ins or getting lost in the labyrinth beneath the mountain. "The air moves this way," Aiyana said, at a junction where 3 tunnels met. "That means an opening to the outside." They followed the air current deeper into the mountain, their footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. Elena found herself thinking about the irony of her situation. A woman who'd spent her life under the open sky of the frontier, now crawling through underground passages in search of freedom. Behind them, faint but growing stronger, came the sound of voices. The soldiers had found the mine entrance. "Move," Chato whispered urgently. "They are coming." The tunnel ahead began to slope upward, and Elena's heart soared when she saw a faint grey light in the distance, daylight filtering through the exit. But as they approached, her hope turned to despair. The opening was blocked by a massive boulder that had rolled down from above, leaving only a gap barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through. "We can move it," Aiyana said, examining the obstacle, "but it will take time and noise." The sound of pursuing footsteps was getting closer. Elena made a quick calculation. They had perhaps 10 minutes before the soldiers reached this tunnel. "Do it," she said. I'd rather die trying to escape than surrender without a fight. All three of them put their shoulders to the boulder. It shifted slightly, grinding against the rock walls with a sound like thunder in the enclosed space. Elena was certain the noise would give them away, but they had no choice. The boulder moved another foot, then another. Finally, there was space enough for a person to slip through. "Go," Aiyana said to Elena. "Quickly." "Not without you," she replied, but Chato was already pushing her toward the opening. She squeezed through the gap and found herself on a narrow ledge overlooking a vast valley. The view was breathtaking, endless desert stretching toward mountains that marked the Mexican border, still many miles away, but now within reach. Aiyana emerged next, followed by Chato, who immediately began working to conceal their exit from inside the tunnel. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had grown louder. Voices, the scrape of boots on stone, the occasional curse as someone stumbled in the darkness. They made their way down the mountainside as quickly as the treacherous footing allowed. Elena's legs shook with exhaustion and adrenaline, but she forced herself to keep moving. Freedom was so close, she could almost taste it. The sun was setting when they finally reached the valley floor. In the distance, Elena could see the Rio Grande, its waters reflecting the last light of day like a ribbon of gold. Mexico, safety, a new beginning. "We made it," she said, hardly daring to believe it. But Aiyana was looking back toward the mountain, his expression troubled. "They will not give up so easily. Thornton's men know these borderlands as well as we do." As if summoned by his words, riders appeared on the ridge above them. A dozen men outlined against the darkening sky, too far away to catch them before they crossed the river, but close enough to ensure there would be no rest, no safety, until they were well beyond the reach of American law. They waded across the Rio Grande as the first stars appeared in the clear desert sky. The water was cold and chest-deep, but Elena had never felt anything so welcoming. Each step took her further from the life she'd known and closer to whatever lay ahead. On the Mexican shore, they paused to rest and tend their horses. Elena looked back across the river toward the territory that had been her home for 8 years, toward the ranch she'd loved and lost, toward the graves of those she'd buried. "Any regrets?" Aiyana asked, following her gaze. Elena thought about it seriously. She was now a fugitive from American law, cut off from everything familiar, facing an uncertain future in a foreign land. But when she looked at this man beside her, this warrior who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't even known she was praying, she felt only gratitude. "Just one," she said finally. "What's that?" "That it took me so long to find you." Aiyana smiled and pulled her close. Above them, the constellation he'd been following for so many months blazed with unusual brightness, as if celebrating their successful journey. "The stars led me to you," he said, echoing the words that had brought them together. "And I had prayed for a sign," Elena replied, completing the circle of their story. 6 months later, in a small village in the Sierra Madre Mountains, Elena stood outside the adobe house she and Aiyana had built with their own hands. Her Spanish was improving daily, and she'd discovered a talent for healing that made her valuable to the local community. Aiyana had found work as a guide for the Mexican government, his knowledge of both Apache and American ways proving invaluable in the complex politics of the borderlands. A letter had arrived that morning from Tom Bradley, forwarded through a complex network of contacts. The ranch had sold for enough to ensure all the workers could start new lives. Sheriff Wells had been removed from office after a federal investigation into corruption. James Thornton had overextended himself financially and fled to San Francisco to escape his creditors. "Justice comes in its own time," Aiyana said, reading over her shoulder. Elena folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. The past was important, but it no longer defined her future. That belonged to the man beside her, and the life they were building together in this valley where two cultures had learned to coexist. "Come," she said, taking his hand. "I want to show you something." They walked to the small garden behind their house, where Elena had planted wildflowers native to both Arizona and Mexico. The blooms created a riot of color against the adobe walls, purple lupines from her homeland growing beside Mexican marigolds, a living symbol of two worlds united. "Our children will know both cultures," she said, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly where the first signs of new life were just beginning to show. "They'll speak both languages, know both sets of stars." Aiyana knelt and placed his hand over hers, his eyes bright with wonder and joy. "The stars brought us together for this," he said, "to create something new, something that honors both our peoples." That night, as they lay together under the vast canopy of the southern sky, Elena thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd lost a ranch and gained a homeland. She'd given up security and found adventure. She'd left behind a life of solitary struggle and discovered the joy of shared purpose. "Do you think they'll ever stop looking for us?" she asked. "Does it matter?" Aiyana replied. "We have each other. We have this place. We have hope for the future. Some treasures are worth more than safety." Elena smiled in the darkness. Miguel had taught her to be strong. This man had taught her to be brave. The difference, she realized, was the difference between surviving and truly living. Above them, the stars wheeled through their ancient patterns, indifferent to human borders, unchanging witnesses to all the love and loss and hope that played out in the desert below. They had guided a lonely warrior to a grieving widow, brought two hearts together across the vast divide of culture and history. In the end, Elena thought as sleep began to claim her, that was all any love story really was. Two people choosing each other against impossible odds, trusting that the stars that had led them together would light their way forward into whatever tomorrow might bring. The desert night was quiet except for the distant cry of a coyote and the soft whisper of wind through the mountain passes. It was the sound of freedom, of new beginnings, of love that had transcended every boundary set against it. It was the sound of home.